Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. I'm Dr. Carmen Imes. Today we are picking it up in Exodus chapter 21. We're going to talk about verses 3 through 6, which are right here towards the beginning of the mishpatim, or judicial decisions that Moses delivered to the people at Mount Sinai. Now, if you haven't watched last week's video, you'll want to start with that because we set some important groundwork for understanding the particularities of these laws today. So we'll wait for you right here while you go watch that one. One thing to know before we read this week's passage is that there's a particular grammatical structure that's helpful because it signals what's going on content-wise. And this is the ki im structure of biblical case law. Ki and im both mean if, but they're used in different ways. So ki is a way of initiating a new paragraph or a new topic, and im is the subpoints under that topic. So all throughout the Mishpatim, you'll find new topics started with the if, that is ki in Hebrew, and then im will do subcategories under that. So last week we read, if you hire a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years. That's the ki. If you hire a Hebrew servant, spelled ki in Hebrew. Verse 3, where we're starting this week, is an im, which is giving a subpoint. So under that broader umbrella of hiring a Hebrew servant, we're now going to deal with specific subtypes or particular situations that might vary from person to person in a situation like this. So picking it up at verse 3. If he came alone, he shall leave alone. If he possessed a wife, his wife may leave with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she bore him sons or daughters, the woman and her offspring will belong to her master, and he must leave alone. But if the servant insists, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him to the deity, and he shall bring him to the door or to the door frame, so his master may pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. Okay, so this is not the end of the so-called slavery laws or the laws about debt servitude, but it deals with all of the cases involving a male servant, and we've dealt with several subpoints in this section. So the first subpoints in verse 3 treat the marital status of the one who's being hired. So does it matter whether the man is married or not? Does that change anything? Well, if he came unmarried, then he leaves unmarried. If he came married, then he leaves married. So in other words, any prior marriage is protected for a man who enters into a contract such as this one. The next subpoints deal with a change of marital status while the man is employed or while he's paying off his debt. And this change of marital status comes because he's marrying into the household. Now, this would be a situation where if a man is in debt so that he's working off his debt, he doesn't have the money he needs to enter into a marriage relationship because marriage involves an exchange of wealth between two families. He doesn't have the money for a bride price. So if he enters into a marriage during his up to 6 years of service for the master, then it's the master's generosity that has allowed that. The master has provided the means for the marriage. Therefore, the woman and any children produced remain the responsibility, the financial responsibility of the master or the employer. So let's think through a couple of scenarios that might lead to a situation like this. So under some circumstances, an employer may offer a woman in marriage to a male servant. Maybe he's taken that woman in as an act of compassion to a poor family, similar to a male indentured servant, except unlike the case that we'll deal with next week, the woman doesn't marry the master or one of his sons. Maybe they're already married. So she's eligible for marriage, but she's not already attached to a member of the household, so she's available. And because the master has taken responsible for her and for her marital status, then he could offer her in marriage to a man who's working for him. Now, this might sound horrible to modern ears, but we have to remember that every marriage in the ancient world was arranged by the male head of household. And so if a woman has been brought into this man's household under his protection, it's his responsibility to find a marriage partner for her. And if he does so with one of his current indentured servants who's paying off a debt to him, then that does not change her relationship to him as head of household. He still retains financial responsibility for her. Bruce Wells notes that a 13th century contract from Emar stipulated conditions by which an indentured servant could bring his wife and children along when his service is completed. So presumably, an Israelite employer could make similar arrangements, but we don't see an example of that here. Notice that the marriage here to this woman is voluntary, but marriage cannot be forced upon the servant. And they can't become a tool to sort of get them both out of servitude. They need to continue to pay off their debts or to keep their financial commitments. Now, the really fascinating thing is the ritual at the end of this passage, whereby a servant could become a permanent member of the master's household. So there are lots of questions around this. We're seeing like a glimpse of a practice that we don't really know exactly how it worked out. But remember, any servitude in ancient Israel is voluntary. The man has volunteered to come and work off his debts by selling his labor to the employer. Now, there might be a situation in which he decides, I like working here as part of this household. This is better than striking out on my own. Maybe the land that he inherited is not very fruitful and he really can't make a living on it. Or maybe he's part of a family that has so many sons that there's just not enough left over for him. Maybe he's just not a great financial manager. And so he finds that it's better to rent than to own. It's better to have somebody else responsible for the land that I live on. So for whatever reason, a man could decide to stay permanently connected to this household. And in that case, they go through a particular ceremony where he is brought before God. Let's go back to see how it's worded exactly. If the servant insists, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him to the deity, Ha Elohim, and he shall bring him to the door or to the door frame, so his master may pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. Now, the two debates here relate to whether what is being referred to here by the deity or Ha Elohim, and where is the door frame? So is he going to the sanctuary, the central sanctuary, and going before God, before Yahweh? And is there a door frame there that he submits his ear to be pierced into the door frame? That's one possibility. A problem with that possibility is that even we don't have a tabernacle quite yet, but even once the tabernacle is built, it doesn't have a wooden door frame. It'd be a little hard to pierce your ear into one of the poles of the tabernacle. So this seems to presume a more established building that would come after they've entered into the land. So this might be anticipatory, or it might be a later law that's being put back here. There are different ways of sorting that out. But there are three main views on who Ha Elohim is referring to. It could refer to judges. There are a number of interpreters who think this is referring to humans who are functioning as judges in Israelite society. So maybe they're taking the servant to the city gate and they're deciding his case. And these judges kind of stand in the place of God because they're making judicial decisions. I don't find that view very persuasive because we don't have clear examples of it elsewhere, of judges being referred to in this way. Another possibility that some people have suggested is that this is referring to teraphim, or household gods, that would have been kept by the doorway of a house. So they're bringing the servant to the doorway of the house where he serves, and above that doorway or near that doorway is a shelf with the household gods on it. representing the ancestors. Now, this is problematic in my view for a couple of reasons. First, God is very clear that they're to worship only him and not to have other gods before him. So if we're going to refer to these teraphim as Elohim, Ha-Elohim, then it seems like we have a contradiction to the Decalogue, which we just heard last chapter. Some have tried to say these teraphim were not worshipped, they were just honored. However, in the book of Judges, pagan worship is associated with the teraphim. And in Josiah's reform, the land is purged of teraphim. So I feel like they have a pretty consistently negative characterization in the Old Testament. And so I don't find it persuasive that this is the referent of Ha-Elohim. I think it's more likely that we're talking about the deity, that is Yahweh. And whether the ceremony takes place fully at the central sanctuary, so you bring the servant to the central sanctuary and present them to God so that they can take an oath of loyalty or whatever and then perform this ritual in the doorway there, or whether they go before God and then come back to the household where they will serve and do the piercing ceremony in the doorway of that house. I'm open to either possibility, but I do think that that Yahweh is the deity that they're coming before in some sense. By marking him in the ear, everyone would know, because it's so physically obvious, that the servant has elected to stay in servitude longer than 6 years. That is, they have voluntarily made their role permanent in the household. Now, next week, we'll deal with the even more difficult passage of what happens with women. Female servants do not have quite the same parameters. They are not allowed to go free. Many people have been disgusted by this and say that it points to the Bible's misogyny. And so we're going to talk about that next week. If you know me pretty well, you'll know that that's not going to be my approach. So come back next week and we'll sort it out together. In the meantime, if you're enjoying this trip through Exodus and you want to have some more tools for knowing how to think about Old Testament law, I would recommend my book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. It's an easy read. It's not a dense textbook. I tell stories, use illustrations and diagrams, and I help you discover the relevance of the laws at Sinai for the Christian life today. There's also a course, a video course corresponding to the chapters in the book available from SeminaryNow. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to check out that course. It's not a 4-credit course, it's an enrichment course that's suitable for anyone of any level of learning. It's accessible, I tell stories, and I kind of walk you through the book in video form. So if that sounds great, check out the link in the description. Either way, I'll see you back next week for another Torah Tuesday.